schlep all that stuff over here. Okay. So I will call to order this special meeting of the Village of Trumansburg Board of Trustees, since we do have 3 board members present. I don't see any other quorums of any other boards. Does any village board member have a change to the agenda? We do have a privilege of the floor public comment period, which I am going to move to the end of the meeting. For any members of the public who would like to ask questions or make comments. So we can move right into our discussion with the towns of Ulysses, Covert, and Hector regarding our contracts for 2025 fire and EMS protection. As we've done in previous years, please ask questions as we go. Don't have to hold questions for the end. We don't stand on formality. We're a small group, so if you have questions, just shout them right out. I think we'll start as we normally do with fire. And we will look at the 2024-25 adopted budget from last year, and then what we're proposing for this year. You see the change column on the right side. And then, as I said, any questions, please fire away. So hopefully everyone's had a chance to review some of this. So I will move relatively quickly, so stop me if there's something you want to discuss. Essentially, the first several lines see no change or a slight decrease. The first increase is in gas, is that gas and electric? Gas and electric. Going up a little bit. 10% sounds like a lot, but it's only $500. A little bit of increase to the training line. No increases to the next several lines. Slight decrease to vehicle repair. Workers' comp insurance has seen a bit of an increase. And then effectively no change to the rest of the regular expense lines. Where you will see an increase, that is basically is the increase to the budget, will be in the 4th line from the bottom, fire apparatus. We are increasing the reserve contribution by $25,000. You'll recall several years ago, and you have all of the last 4 or 5 years, we were in the $125,000 range for a while. We had intended an increase to $150,000 in 2020, but due to the pandemic, we pushed that off a couple of years. The middle column, I guess it's 4th from the right. That is our current reserve balance. I don't have, Matt, you might, Chief Taylor probably has it, what the next, not the one we just ordered. But what the
next will be, 1804.
So the one we just ordered, the replacement cost was 900 and change, and that's going to be due in 2025. The subsequent vehicle will be what year?
I want to say 28.
27 or 28.
Or 20 years, because we're trying to spread the.
Right.
It's 20 years, 29.
And do you have an estimate for a cost this year for that? 900. So what we're seeing is that, you know, we had a replacement cycle for these vehicles that we constructed many years ago. We try to keep up with costs of inflation. The ladder truck, which we leased for purchase in 2011 or 12 at the time, was around 800,000. Today's prices for that same vehicle are about 1.4 million. So we're seeing those kinds of escalating costs across the board, regardless of type of truck. So we're simply trying to make sure we keep the reserve lines healthy enough to afford these vehicles as they come due for replacement.
So are the ones that are being got rid of surplus, is there a resale market?
There is, and it varies. So I think occasionally there's a trade-in market for it from the manufacturer that we buy it from. Most of the time we sell it second hand or on the secondary market. Those receipts that we get, we generally put back in the reserve account. But you know, and Chief Taylor will have better numbers than I will, but my recollection is a $900,000 new vehicle. Maybe we can get 150 for it, 125. You know, that's if we're fortunate. If we're less fortunate, then we get less. So we do get what we can from them. But it's not pennies on the dollar, but close.
What do you keep them at, 20 years now, or you trying to
Try to keep it at 20. I
220?
think NFPA recommends, so they've shortened it, haven't they?
They want to.
Wow.
It hasn't passed yet, but they do want replacement to be shortened.
We have stretched a couple of the vehicles in the last few years out to 22, 23, if they're in good enough shape.
One of the places that was 25.
25.
Is it, so I know in Ulysses, we have gone to a model of, rolling out or replacing vehicles faster than we used to. Because the resale value is better 5 years out as opposed to 10 years out when you've got essentially scrap on your hands. Is that the case with fire equipment, or does it immediately lose value? You know, it's worth half as much year two. Right?
I think there's a big depreciation hit right out of the gate, so. Once you get over 20 years, most fire departments shy away from trucks because. They're just not built to last much longer. Is there some out there, sure, you go down south, you see 40-year-old trucks, but they're not northern trucks. You know, coming out of the northeast or out of a snowed out area. You know, we started to put. So, I mean, that's probably a conversation we could have and look at the resale market. And try to time it to where. You know, you can do it, but, you know, town trucks, I think big trucks are probably the same as fire trucks. But you take a state bid Ford F-250, and you're buying it for pennies on the dollar on a state bid, and then you can secondhand that out pretty good because they're $100,000 from the dealership. And Joe Landscaper will buy it from you for a good bunch. It doesn't really work with fire trucks that way. It's pretty skilled market on who buys. So, there's probably some validity to that. As far as if you sold it sooner, you could get more money, but is it gonna really? But then your replacement costs are still jacking. Through the pandemic, we were looking at double-digit increases on fire trucks every 6 months. It was just them trying to keep up with how things were going. And, you know, you weren't getting that on the secondary market. You might get a little bit better depending on the truck and how desperate, you know, because if a fire truck's $900,000, there is a department out there that'll pay you $150 for a used truck because it's better than $900. Especially if they're only doing 100 calls. But, there's a big risk with used trucks.
Oh, yeah.
We did look at that 6-7 years ago, I want to say. And there was a better resale on the used fire truck for us, but it wasn't enough to make up for the capital up front to accelerate the replacement cycle. So if just for round numbers sake, if we go from a 20-year replacement to a 10-year replacement, and now we need $1 million every 10, which is escalating at a 10% compounded rate every year. And instead of 125, we can get 350. The 125 to 350 looks nice. But the million compounded at 10% by the second replacement, we're pretty tight again.
So it doesn't really have anything to do with the use of the vehicle at this point. It's just that it's an aged fire truck.
It's an aged fire truck, and the NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association. Although I don't know that they have a way to demand it, but they effectively require fire departments that are certified by them to replace every 20 years. Technology changes enough.
So they have standards to go by, and that's what we're on. Okay.
Yeah, they're not required, but they're considered. The standard, so if something happens, we go into litigation, that FPA comes into play. Yes, it wasn't required, but this is what you should follow.
Right.
Well, and also, I mean, in practical terms, you start running into maintenance requirements and any maintenance cost also reflects downtime on the machine, right? So it's just.
Right, but I mean,
Diminishing
if you don't
returns.
have that many calls and not using your equipment, that was my point, how many calls you actually have as to how much use of the fire truck. So if there's standards to be met, that's even more serious. So, thank you.
Well, it sounds like since. If I'm layering the timelines correctly, it sounds like there was a lot of escalation in cost during the pandemic.
Huge.
And the last time this village, the calculations was 6 or 7 years ago, pre-pandemic, and Bid Darfler isn't here and loves crunching numbers. And so I'm just throwing out there, it may be worth looking into I mean, again, I understand what you're saying, but since Bid Darfler is not here, he might be it might be worth looking into again, just because those escalating costs. And maybe that in and of itself makes it a non-starter, but if the escalating costs may also. It might not be 350, maybe it's 550,
Yeah, I think, Caitlin, and I certainly will look at it again, but I think we're on the wrong side of that cost structure. So when we looked at it last time, costs on the new side were going up, say 5 to 8% a year. And we couldn't keep up with that a few cycles out. Now they're going up 10 to 15% a year. And the resale has not increased that much. It's increased some, but not enough, I think, to make up. But we'll certainly take a look at it. If there's a dollar to be squeezed from a stone, then we'll certainly try to.
Plus, another thing that we're getting into is a lot of these companies are what's the word I'm trying to say? Preparatory, yeah. Preparatory. Can't say that word tonight. But anyway, so we're getting to the point now where we'll put out a bid for apparatus, or we'll put out a bid for gear, and we'll search up 3 or 4 companies. There's not 3 or 4 companies. There's one. The only place you can get it from is that particular company. So we don't have a choice on who to go with. And it's becoming more and more frequent.
So that's the bad news. The good news is the overall fire budget goes up 5%. 5% is not nothing. But most of it, or all of it really, as I look at that number, all of it is really in that increased reserve funding for future apparatus.
Or just real quick, I pulled up on apparatus sheet that we did at the time, so 1804 is next up. We got it listed at 2030. We bought that truck at 474. With escalation at the time, we figured 856 at 2030. So we're at 900 now. We're still 6 years away,
Yeah.
so just food for thought.
We should all quit these jobs and go into the fire and construction business.
I was listening to the Homer News today, and they have to order a new ladder truck, and they got quoted 2.5 million for their ladder truck.
Mine's just bought one last week, 2.3 or something like that.
Any other comments, questions on the budget piece before we get to the contract breakdown? So with a proposed budget of 503,895, you'll all recall, everyone's been here for at least one, if not many, of these cycles. A few years ago, we began to implement a contract breakdown that factored in property values in addition to simple call volume. As you know, we used a simple breakdown of call volume, a 3-year rolling average of call volume. We used that for many, many years. And after much research, Ben Darfler, who was fire commissioner at the time, began to look at the concept, and he worked with Chief Taylor on this closely, the concept of the costs that would be incurred regardless of whether we have any calls or not, versus those calls that can be attributed to, or the costs of calls that can be attributed to the calls themselves. So more calls versus less calls, that piece of the budget is referred to as the variable cost. Fixed costs are, we never have a call, everyone sits in the station. What are those costs? And then he took that split, which is roughly a 75-25 split. And the fixed costs are now factored against total property assessments in the contracting municipality. And the variable piece are divided by call volume, because that's the biggest factor when it comes to those variable costs. How many calls are there and where do they go? We phased this in over multiple years, and you see at the bottom, we are in year 3 of this phased in approach. And you can see the increases or decreases associated with each municipality. And so while the fire budget itself is only increasing by, or is increasing by 5.2%, the effect to any given municipality could be very different. We're sensitive to that. But I think this model, at least on conceptually, this model is better than a straight call volume model, because fire protection is effectively property protection. So having a component that factors in property values is important. Now, there is, I don't want to steal anyone's thunder. There is a concern that the village has with respect to how, especially over the last couple of years, how assessments are calculated. We have seen rapid and large-scale assessment increases in the village of Trumansburg and the town of Ulysses that have not occurred in our neighboring towns. So there is beginning to be some concern that, are we equitably distributing, even with this model, are we equitably distributing these fixed costs when one county does assessments very different from another? Ben Darso's not here tonight. I did have a conversation with him today. He is, because he came up with this model, he is looking at equalization rates to see whether there is something that can be layered on top of our model to use, because Tompkins County uses 100% fair market value. Seneca and Schuyler do not.
Schuyler does, like we're reassessing again, it's only been 2 years.
But you have an equalization rate.
We have a very, it's fallen, we're at 78% after 2 years.
Right.
So we're doing it again, so we're trying to keep it at 100%, but it's finishing so quickly that they're not keeping up with it.
So maybe we will, and this is not something for this budget cycle, but it is something that the village is looking at to say, okay, if Tompkins County and its, be careful, we're live streaming. If Tompkins County and its infinite wisdom decides to reassess everyone every single year at 100% fair market value, but our neighboring counties do it every 2 or 3 years and apply an equalization rate in those years where reassessments are not done, should we, the village, then, and it takes, there's a potentially a cost associated with the labor, with the clerical work. But do we then have to take a neighboring municipality's assessment, apply the equalization rate to come up with a new number to apply that to this model? And we may very well do that, depending on what assessments look like. And of course, I know there's state level legislation that always goes nowhere with respect to dictating to the counties how they do their assessments and so on. But while we're in the system that we're in now, it is something that we will likely be forced to look at, because if the same house on one side of Seneca Road is assessed at X and the same house on the other side in the town of Covert is assessed for $75,000 less, simply because of the way assessment departments work, then in that particular example, the village of Trumansburg is subsidizing fire protection in the town of Covert, and we don't want to do that any more than is unavoidable.
And for Ulysses, it's a huge problem because I'm looking at these percentages, right? And we've got a large property tax base, and I don't objectively oppose the assessment model, but it's not a fair one in the current incarnation, and it can't. So we're gonna have to have it looked at. I mean, I don't think it's a maybe we look at it. I think it absolutely has to be looked at because Ulysses is bringing the majority of the properties to the district. So. I know for a fact the property owner in both municipalities, in both Covert and Ulysses, that my property in Covert is undervalued. And I'm happy to pay lower taxes as a result of that, but it's undervalued compared to a similar property in Ulysses.
Well, we're gonna fix it next year. I'm doing a revale right now, so next year will be 100%. Give me a year.
Yeah, but the problem is this year we're gonna subsidize you guys.
Yeah,
And that's where my problem is, and we're not gonna get the money back. It's not like it equals out and we get made, where the village gets made whole. The model isn't fair inherently in this part.
Well, that was the problem last time when we were talking about doing it this way. There was too much discrepancies going on. Yes, I do hope that he's gonna look at that.
When would you have your public hearing on the fire budget?
Ours has historically been either the first meeting in December or based on when we can get the contract. Last year, we did it, so we got the contract in December, so we couldn't schedule until January. So usually this past year, it was the second Tuesday in January. Which is after.
We did ours December, January, too. We were, yeah, after the budget.
It really has to be done before your fiscal year, for your budget. Right.
By contract, we have to pay our bill by the end of January or February.
February, bill here.
So what I'll actually do is, I'll take a look at the equalization rate now. And apply it to this budget. If I can get that done, it's only September 5th. If I can get that done in the next week or so. And I'll have Jessica resend this
That'd be helpful. I
with
appreciate that.
the newer breakdowns.
Great to hear my taxes are going up in COVID, so thank you.
Well, you're giving a heads up, you know, so you'll know.
So what you're saying is I should send stuff.
At least you don't have to pay for the fire districts. We do. We have to pay for Interlake and Adams. Trumansburg.
It's more fun.
They overlap?
Okay.
I didn't.
Interlake.
Any other comments, questions on the fire side of things? Any fire department questions for Chief Taylor? Doesn't have to all be boring numbers.
How many volunteers or how many members do you have?
48. Growing slowly, lose a couple, gain a couple. We're better off than a lot. That's for sure.
How's the funding going for this fire?
We have 3.5 million in hand. We have an application for another 1.5 million from New York State. Will get us to 5. We have low interest loan offers from USDA at 2%, or as much as we want to borrow. I'm hoping to not borrow, but
What's the total price tag gonna be?
right now it's 8 to 9. I'm actually thinking there might be a way to cut that down. We have our first kind of concept design meeting with Chief Taylor and Joel, Fay, and our engineers from MRB. 16th, so a week and a half. We kind of have the concept, an initial concept design that we put together back in 2021, so we're going to revisit that. Because in 2021, the quote was 6.5 to 7, and now it's around 9. So we're going to see if we can make some changes. I do have some ideas as far as that goes. So funding is, if we can get that number down to 6, we're more than halfway there. If we get that 1.5 from New York State, we're basically there. So stay tuned on that piece.
Matt, anything new that we need to know?
There's not a lot going on in the fire side of things. Training's well attended. We're waiting on the radio grant that we put in with Ithaca. And Enfield, you don't know, Enfield is no longer a company, they're a fire district now, so they operate much the same way Lansing does. They have a board of commissioners. So we're waiting, hopefully here this month or next month, we'll get a yay or nay on that grant. It's probably the fourth time we put in for it, so maybe the fourth time's the charm. Third. Yeah, I know. So,
I'm glad they're still trying, so that's
yeah,
good.
yeah. There's probably money out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a, we say it every year, but I think it needs to not be not said. Too many negatives in that sense. It can't go unsaid. You know, the thanks we owe to the fire company, to Chief Taylor. The recruitment of, I mean, not to sound ageist, but you know, your line officers, average age is in their forties and getting
Yeah.
younger versus the other way around. You know, when I first came on the board, a million years ago, I think membership was at 90 something. So attrition is about what we see nationally, but you don't normally see that. Normally you see attrition and aging and no recruitment. We have attrition in terms of overall membership numbers, but there's still recruiting going on. The average age is declining. So if we can maintain 40 something for a long time, 40 something members for a long time at a, you know, from the high school age on up into the 60s, then I think that speaks well for the department. A lot of departments in a lot of places are going paid. They're being forced to go paid. If we have to go paid fire, and you can throw everything, all tax caps out the window, because it's not something we can't do. It's mandated. Which leads to the next topic, because that'll be mandated here shortly as well, but we'll get to that on the next page. So as long as Chief Taylor and the members of the fire company and their leadership can keep us from going paid fire, we will continue to greatly appreciate it.
As politicians at the local level, the big one that's gonna rock the entire fire world is OSHA is revising their fire brigade standard. And they're actually looking to put an NFPA in, is no longer a standard, but as the rule. And I know we're live, but NFPA is a not-for-profit, for-profit agency. They write rules based on a lot of so-called research, I'll call it. And there's a lot of dollars behind that agency and how they operate in the back world. And in the hospital world, we live by NFPA 101, which is life safety. I'd ask a lot of questions at a conference to NFPA engineers, and I got a lot of blank stares, and just, that's how it is. And I sat on a few of those technical committees as backups, and we'd have meetings and standards were put forward because guys had to catch planes back to home base. So it was like, let's pass it, move on, we'll fix it in the next revision in 3 years. And the problem is those revisions for 3 years, like with fire trucks, they fall into where those are required. And so the cost of fire trucks goes up, not only because of manpower and material costs, but new safety standards that have been pushed into the ground either by manufacturer reps or people that sit on these technical committees that have a vested interest in things. You know, that's how the world works in the big world. So, you know, email your cohorts in Congress and say, we really need a good revision on this OSHA standard, because it could cost small departments like this to either consolidate with others around us and then become paid, or Ithaca kind of starts to sprawl out. And those costs escalate fast. You start talking about it.
Because Matt, part of that mandate too is training mandates, right?
Well, there's training mandates, there's physical fitness, there's.
So basically what they want is they want volunteer fire companies to raise to the standard of a paid fireman. And these are guys that have, their job isn't to be a fireman. Their job is, you know, they have other jobs and they have families and that they have to consider, and if they raise the standards equal to that of a paid firefighter, then
Not good.
it's not doable
But
to
you
keep
can-
your volunteers anyway.
You can, I mean, I've heard, that you have the fire departments locally at least have a lot of support from the elected officials.
Sounds like it.
Yeah.
We're
I mean,
hoping.
Congress and the Assemblyman seem to be,
Yeah.
pushing to get things like that further. So I'm hoping, I mean, it's not passed, yeah.
No.
It's not legislation and it won't have to be. So the problem with, and I'm not gonna wander way out into the weeds on this. But the problem with federal agencies is legislation is not required for them to disseminate rules. So whether it's OSHA or HUD, they can disseminate rules unless Congress acts affirmatively to shut down a rule. They have been given the authority to do this. That's the purpose of the way the federal agencies are structured. So there is a version of this movie, and I'm hoping it doesn't happen, but there is a version of this movie where the same thing that happened to EMS in the late 90s happens to fire, where the requirements become so stringent that the only people who will do it are people who will want to be paid to do it. And you won't have people volunteering to do it because they can't keep up with the requirements. That's the worst version of this movie. And that's kind of where some of these regs look like they might end up. And the problem is, and I don't want to get too far into it publicly, I'm happy to talk about it offline with anyone who's interested, is there are millions and millions and millions of lobbying dollars going to work in DC to promote paid fire. Because paid fire in the minds of these lobbying groups, one very large one in particular, paid fire is the way to go. And so if the requirements can become so stringent that really everyone has to go paid, then those millions of dollars will be well spent because they'll be recouped in the form of other revenue. So we're in 1985, if you want to look at the EMS timeline. We're in 1985 to 88, where 15 years from then, there were no volunteer EMTs. There was no volunteer EMS department in Trumansburg 15 years later. I'm hoping we can head that off. I'm hoping that some of it, again, unfortunately, gets back to age, younger fire company members who can keep up with training better will last longer. But yes, if any of us, I know some of you do, I know I do, if any of us have conversations with congressmen, and it would have to be federal, state's not really gonna help us. If we can push back on some of these impending regulations, I think that'll help. It'll help a lot. Okay, anything else on fire? Speaking of paid departments. We have our EMS budget. Joel is here to answer specific questions with respect to line items, personnel, department policies, etc. Thanks, Matt. If anyone comes up or thinks of questions after the meeting or with respect to the fire department, just send Chief Taylor an email. So two things I'll mention before we get into the line by line. Just looking at the projected actual number.
Which one?
Okay. Two comments I'll make. One is, it is only due to, and I don't want to embarrass him or put him on the spot, but it is only due to the extraordinary time management skills of a certain Joel Fay that your 24-25 projected actual number is not substantially higher due to staffing realities. And so thank you, Joel, for all of your efforts there, both his personal time management skills as well as the management of the department. The other thing I'll mention is that as you'll see in the projected actual versus adopted numbers, the village looks to be at least $107,000 over budget in EMS this year. That number will likely increase due to some unexpected legal costs. And as we've discussed in many years past, when the village goes, we try not to go over budget. And we don't often go over budget, but when we do, it's a doozy. And so all those years where we're a little bit under budget, they don't come close to making up for the big years when we're drastically over budget. And of course, we don't have a way to recoup that or claw that back anyway because of the different budget years and so forth. So we've tried to keep the proposed 2025 budget as close as possible, and you'll see it as close as possible to the projected actual number. I'll start at the top, personnel. And I'll have another comment to make about personnel towards the end, but I don't want to muddy the waters just yet. Personnel, we're going to see an increase once we're able to staff correctly or staff appropriately. Again, Joel is personally shouldering a lot of the burden for some of these extra calls that we take, which again, I'll get to shortly. And the reason I keep alluding to it is I'm open to any suggestions anyone has when we get to that. Our contingency line is intentionally a vague catch-all. It could be for overtime, it could be for legal costs, it could be for vehicle maintenance. That one of the ambulances sat. I saw some snide comment on Facebook about an ambulance sitting in McGuire for 3 weeks. And it was because they couldn't find a part. So if we can't get a part, and the ambulance can't come back, what do we do? So those repair costs, when they occur, kind of are what they are. Contractual, that's kind of supplies. Does that include medical, Joel? I don't think so. No. So station supplies, non-medical supplies, gas and electric hasn't changed too much. Community outreach has only gone up $500. No change to the renovation line. No substantial change to the next couple lines. Scuba, you'll remember a conversation last year, the year before, about a water rescue team. I think the phrase dive team has a specific certification or connotation to it, but a water rescue team. Joel, jump in. I believe that's been turned over in large part to the fire company.
So the fire company is starting to spearhead that. But if it continues how we hope, it's going to be a combined effort between fire and EMS in the long term. But it opens us up to a lot of grants and money by having the fire department involvement.
Good. No substantial change to the next several lines, though we get to vehicle insurance has increased slightly. You'll notice ambulance legal, which is the 5th line up. Our projected actual is a large number. We don't anticipate that same number next year. I think that $70,000 number might be light, but we'll see where that goes. State retirement is a function of payroll, as is Medicare, et cetera. On the reserve side, we have increased the contribution to equipment. Joel has put together a much more comprehensive replacement cycle for non-vehicle equipment than we've ever had before. So now we can hopefully get every piece of equipment, which is a lot, that EMS requires on a standardized replacement cycle. EMS vehicle, fire trucks are going up very, very fast. Ambulances are going up, but not as fast, fortunately. So we've only increased the EMS vehicle contribution by 5,000. EMS station and office upkeep, this is a new line. This is for both this station and the projected future emergency facility, having a maintenance and replacement cycle for interior, for office furniture, et cetera. And then EMS communication, this is radios, yeah?
Yes.
Again, because of the,
It's, I expanded that, so it's not just radios, it's anything related to communications, so it's our computers and our ambulances, our Wi-Fi and GPS units. So it's been expanded well past, so truly anything that has to do with communications with us, telling.
and so again, as a function of a kind of a comprehensive replacement cycle that we're trying to get on for those pieces of equipment. That line has been increased. And so bottom line is a larger number. It's the same issue we discuss every single year. EMS is healthcare. And so it's increasing in line with national healthcare costs, which are all in the double digits, most of them in the mid to high teens. We're fighting as best we can to keep it in the pre-teens. But that is a struggle. The one thing that I was alluded to before that I want to mention, there is, it is public knowledge, I suppose, or it's public information. I continue to have a real concern about call coverage growing beyond our ability to financially handle it. I think if necessary, Joel can staff a second ambulance. If necessary, he can staff a second ambulance 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I don't know how easily we will be able to cover that cost. In July and August, or was it June and July? I think it was July and August. Dryden Ambulance. And this is a conversation that's currently occurring at the county level as well. Dryden Ambulance had 40% of their calls occur outside of their district. They are considering, is there anything that they can do about that? If not, it simply stretches them much thinner, forces them to staff more potentially in the future. Most of those 40% was to their south. Some of it was to Cortland, the Cortland area. Ours are staying in the 10 to 15% out of district range. If something doesn't change for the better to our south and the other side of the lake, I see our number increasing towards 20 or more. What the answer to that is, I don't know. There are differences of opinion about what mutual aid requires versus what we can decline in terms of those calls outside of district. We have no ability to charge a municipality for a call in their district without a contract. So there needs to be some changes that occur. The county is involved in the conversation, but I sometimes am not entirely convinced that the county fully I think emergency response grasps the dire nature of the situation. But I'm not entirely sure that policymakers at the county level all grasp it. So if you have the opportunity to have those conversations with any of those folks, please do. Because effectively what's happening is Dryden much more so because of the percentages and the size of their department. But the taxpayers in the town of Dryden, the village of Dryden, town of Ulysses, town of Covert, town of Hector, and the village of Trumansburg are subsidizing ambulance response outside of those borders.
Ithaca.
Primarily the town and city of Ithaca.
The city of Ithaca residents aren't paying for ambulance service in their taxes at all. Because they don't.
Now, it's not just in those directions, you know, Dryden responds to the north, Cortland has their own ambulance issues, Cuba County has ambulance issues. Of course, we travel further north in the town of Covert. When necessary, our call map continues to grow. And it's fascinating to see it. I mean, it's an intellectual exercise. This is all really fascinating to kind of see how the network spreads over time. But financially, it's not sustainable. So that's not
Without a contract with the town of the city of Ithaca, we can't charge them.
correct.
And if we go to them and say, we will only do it if we have a contract.
We don't have the ability to say we will only do it because of the mutual aid structure, mutual aid network.
The state mandates that we cover all adjacent districts.
And there's some, there's some potentially some wiggle room in there, certain types of calls, is there any flexibility? Less emergent calls, is there any flexibility? Do we take it or not? If we're en route back from another call, do we have to take, there's gray area in there. But on principle and conceptually, the mutual aid network requires an adjacent agency to pick up a call that the home agency can't take.
Couple questions. What percentage are you seeing of banks coming in or other agencies coming in into our ambulance districts too? I mean, because mutual suggests that two parties are benefiting
Right.
each other.
But we're gonna get a bill from banks.
The municipality doesn't.
Right.
Probably, I think, about 8 calls a year they cover, last I checked.
8?
Yeah,
Bain's did 8 for us.
yeah. We've done a tremendous job covering a lot of our second calls. So it certainly is not mutual aid. And the slippery slope, opting out of a mutual aid plan might sound appealing because then our ambulance stays in our district, but then when there is a second call that we can't answer, there's nobody coming out. So kind of, it kind of bound to it, but it's
Wouldn't bank come down?
not if we opted out of a mutual aid agreement. That's what I'm saying. So
You're on your
if we
own.
decided to say that we're not gonna participate in the state or countywide mutual aid program, nobody's coming to help us. Because we're not gonna go help them.
The banks can bill here, I mean. Banks could bill for what they service.
But it's not worth it at all for them.
Well,
It's a long way, it's a long time.
We bill when we take a call in the city of Ithaca and do a transport.
Right.
And depending on what insurance carrier is, we might, if it's Medicare, it'll be $300 and it cost us $1,800 to send them. Plus they're out of service for the 3 hours that they're transporting this person to upstate.
Right.
So the conversation is finally being had at the county level. I think there needs to be a lot more pressure applied. I hope. Hesitating because I don't know if I want to say this, but what the heck? How long did it take for that flashing light to get installed at the intersection of Perry City and 96?
It's fatalities.
How many fatalities had to occur
Right.
before DOT made that simple change? I hope it doesn't take that kind of a situation for our county legislators to really buckle down and try to do something about this. And really, it really does need state involvement. New York State needs to get much more involved, particularly with the funding side of things.
So what's the update on how the county program for rapid response is? How's that working? Is that helping?
I'll leave it to Joel, as far as how it's helping us. I do see their numbers and it was, I think there were 100 and don't hold me to this number off the top of my head. It was 140 some calls taken in the first 11 days or something like that. So they're responding to a lot of calls of those kind of lower level, non-emergency, non-life threatening, if it's properly triaged by the 911 center, then it'll be the kinds of calls that someone needs assistance, but it's not an urgent medical situation and it is highly unlikely to result in a transport. It sounds like it's helping a lot, particularly with some of the a lift assisted in a nursing home kind of call, where prior to the county's program prior to that program standing up, we might have to go help. Lift an elderly patient off the floor, which is it's a service. It's a valid service, but it's not a medical one. And then the issue really is, the paramedic level care should be reserved for medical incidents. So the county program is certainly helping alleviate some of that pressure on the non-medical things that the medical professionals were picking up. I'm glad it's there. I think it only expands. I don't see it contracting. But it's not helping with the medical emergencies. And agencies not being able to take all of the calls in their home districts.
In terms of collecting from, you were gonna go to a new building, partner,
Yeah,
yeah, done yet, or?
we're close. So I would like to think by the end of the year, we'll be on a pretty good track for that. And I really do hope that that might provide some relief as well. I mean, I'm reluctant to guarantee anything. But with a lot of the numbers and issues in my audits that I performed with our current situation, it's alarming. And I think if we could start recouping some of that loss, it make this a little easier for people.
Well, that was actually gonna be one of my questions, because I'm looking at what our end of year projections are, and they're sizably lower than what we budgeted for. And
And
we're
I
just,
can't explain why.
Yeah.
I truly,
and the call, because the call, I'm looking at call volume's not down. I mean, so, yeah,
I'm concerned. with
Yeah.
the Current vendor, yes.
I'm glad to hear there's movements and what I deeply hope is a different direction.
It is the priority after this meeting for Ben and I to get that done.
And I think on, fire, again, we're fortunate that we have an all volunteer group, and you can see that in that structure. The expense side basically stays static from year to year. EMS, because it is healthcare, we're way past the point of any type of even, I think, attempt at cost control. Sounds like a dangerous thing to say, but short of not having a department.
Right.
Costs are what they are. Payroll is what it is. As we have to increase staffing someday, and again, Joel does an excellent job of we've begun already to kind of phase in, when do we want to have a second crew on? A couple hours here, a couple hours there. The evolution of that over time will be a second full-time ambulance. The longer we can push that off, the better from a cost perspective, but maybe not better from patients. From a medical provision standpoint. Dryden Ambulance had to add a third full-time crew a year and a half ago because of their call volume increasing. So that's, to me, that's inevitable. The trick is, can we find enough revenue to make the shock? To make so that we can absorb it, whether that's through changing insurance billing companies, pressuring, legislators at every level for higher Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement rates, pushing New York State to begin taking seriously a funding mechanism, all of the above when it comes to that. But that's striving for more revenue. I don't see a way around the future increases in expenses.
I will share that kind of the silver lining to the current situation. There is a lot of movement that could be had by any of the municipalities within their building. If you wanted to consider bangs as 100% billing, where they put to collections, they make sure they do everything they can do to get their payment. We're at like 20%. We don't work hard for our money. So if that ever became a priority for a municipality, there's a lot of billing revenue and changes that could be made if anyone chose to do that.
So I would say from our town, we have tried to parallel what the village is doing, because it's very confusing to treat residents who, they all live in the town of Ulysses differently, right? So I think that would be a conversation that I would be interested in having, because I don't think 20% is sustainable. But I also don't want to be big. I don't want to be a private company.
Absolutely.
So where do we? Right, because I don't think maintaining what we're doing is working from a revenue standpoint. The numbers, I don't begrudge paying people what they need to be paid to provide medical. I understand, I'm thinking my own in the town's budget, all of the upward pressure. So I appreciate that costs are effectively what they are. But we need to generate more revenue.
I would ask to just hold off on that conversation. Let's switch to this company and let's see the impact from that. I think that and tell us a lot.
But in terms of the billing, from any company, how could we only be 20% effective?
I say that is the way the municipalities choose to bill. You have full latitude of whether you want to send people to collections to collect that money, how many times you want to bill them before you write it off. Like, there's a lot of movement within the billing law that you have of how stringent or strict you want to be on collecting it. And so when I say that 20% is not effectiveness, it's just, we're not working too hard for our money. We're very kind to our residents.
Right.
I mean, effectively, we set the rates for everything that we charge, right? So even underneath what Joel said, more fundamentally, we set the rates.
Right.
So we don't always recoup any of that, all of that, because of insurance and all of those intricacies, but fundamentally, we control the way we bill for everything that we do.
But I
So
thought
what are you
the-
planning on going to this other service?
I don't have a definitive date. Ben, what do you think is a reasonable timeline?
I mean, at this point, we've been, to be perfectly frank, we've been sidetracked a little bit by this budget, and you all see the legal line, and I'm sure you can sort of fill in the blanks in terms of our time. So we've been sidetracked a little bit as far as pursuing that, but Joel has, I think, maybe 1 or 2 questions to follow up on that our group came up with. As he said, after this meeting is closed, that'll kind of be our next priority, and we hope, within the next month or 2, we'll be able to move in that direction. I think we'll circle back up, or at least send out a notification to that group that met about the billing. And just double check that we're all still on the same page after we have those questions that we raised answered. And from there, we'll move forward. So I expect by the end, or by the beginning of your budget year, we should be on to the new company, if that's the way we go, or at least resolved in one way or another, would be my expectation.
How many billing companies are out there right now?
Oh, there's hundreds. It's whether you want a semi-local one or if you want.
We looked at 3, didn't we?
You looked at.
We looked at-
We looked at 3.
And it's worth pointing out that, now that we have that group that talked about the billing, if we wanted to look at what are we billing for and what are those rates, and start to have those conversations as a group, if remaining cohesive in terms of our rates is a priority, which I think does make sense, then we could circle up again just with that same group and talk through, what is a motor vehicle accident worth in terms of billing and those kinds of decisions. I would be happy to have that conversation. I think from the village's perspective, we review those fairly infrequently, basically when Joel pokes me enough and I say, okay, you're right, let's do this. So if we sort of continued that group and kept that conversation going, I think that would be great. Once we see what the impact of just having a different approach to billing is, that could be a good conversation to have.
Right, and I mean, fundamentally, rural ambulance will always be largely supported by the taxpayer, right? Because private agencies can't do it because they can't make money. So the question is just how much of the department, how much of the cost do we have to rely on the taxpayer for, and how much can we get from elsewhere? The more we can get from elsewhere, the better. One thing I haven't mentioned, I think everyone is aware, but just so you can keep watch alongside everyone else. There have been a couple of successful attempts to pass legislation in Albany that would require EMS as an essential service. None of them have been signed by the governor. I think one actually made it through, but hasn't been signed by the governor. The other one passed the Senate, but not the Assembly. Functionally, the way the bills are structured are that they would require the counties to coordinate EMS service within their borders. What that means would be up to the county. So if you have a county that wants to run an ambulance department, they could. If you have a county like ours, where there are agencies present, then that would just require Tompkins County to effectively do what they're already doing, which is coordinate service. There's no funding arm attached to any of that legislation. So
Of course not.
as you have conversations with, that is something that will be state, not federal. As you have conversations with our friends in Albany, I'm not opposed to the essential service mandate. I think it's honestly silly that fire and law enforcement are mandated, but EMS is not. But it's, I think easily apples to apples, the most expensive of the three. So if it becomes mandated, then there should be a funding mechanism. There should be funding subsidies that come from Albany to help offset the cost. And that's gonna be a lift. Albany is, the legislators I've spoken to who are, the one or two that I've spoken to who are not in favor of funding, apparently are okay with a $240 billion budget, but they don't want to spend 500 million on statewide EMS. So there's a roadblock there that we have to fight through. But that's coming. I would expect, because of some of the things happening downstate, I would expect a mandate to pass and be signed in the next couple of cycles, couple of legislative cycles.
Are you having conversations with Dryden? Because I feel like we all reflect collectively a lot of calls being served in the county. And if there's a way to unify in deep frustration, then we need to, because this is not a sustainable growth model. It's a collapsing one.
Yes, so Dryden has begun participating. So we have a recurring TCOG subcommittee. They've begun attending those meetings and we're having some good conversation. And it's actually, I have to give the county credit. I don't want to make it sound like I'm constantly banging on them. DOER is driving that conversation because they're dispatching the calls, right?
Yeah.
So they see what's happening. And Dryden, I mean, 40% is a lot. I mean, imagine if they get to half of their calls are outside the district, they'll effectively be a regional ambulance service for that side of the lake. And they don't want to be, their taxpayers don't want them to be. But at the moment, they sort of have to be, or those calls don't get answered, at least not timely. So yes, we're maybe a little bit late, but those conversations have started. I don't know where they lead. I don't know what the answer is to that piece. I have some wild ideas that will never fly, but those conversations are at least in process.
Well, I find 15% alarming, like sirens blazing alarming. So 40% is catastrophic.
Yeah, I always envisioned if we got to 15 to 20%, it would be to our north and west. I never imagined it would be to our south, but here we are.
Joel, I feel like one of the last times that we met, there was part of what we were doing is when we were called to Ithaca was being the second ambulance crew at staging. And that there were issues with law enforcement needing to secure the scene, safety issues. Is that continuing to be an issue? Has that resolved?
That has gotten much better within the city and town of Ithaca.
Okay.
It has improved. I think there's a lot of different driving forces that made that change for sure.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Joel, could you talk just briefly though about the steps you've taken to try and minimize those calls? Because I feel like, you know, it's easy to see the trend and feel like it's unstoppable, but Joel has taken, I think, fairly effective proactive steps to reduce those calls. So you see the trend, but it would be double, triple what it actually is. So just, briefly.
Biggest change that was made is we were often called just to stand by at the city line or at the hospital. So they take us, unfortunately, the worst case scenario plays out a lot where then we get a call in Interlaken and we're effectively sometimes 25, 30 minutes away from our call locations. They have stopped doing that unless there's truly no other resources available. That would include Dryden's already in Ithaca, things like that. So that's helped open up our utilization rates. So we're not being tied up on standby. The other big conversation I've really been working at, and I'm not the only one having this, is trying to get the city of Ithaca especially to use their EMD codes the way that they're meant to be used. So we're assigned a priority. The lowest priority would be like an Omega or an Alpha. These are not non-life threatening emergencies. If you go to any metropolitan area, these calls hold for hour, 2 hours, sometimes 6 hours until the next available unit. I strongly think the city of Ithaca needs to go to a system like that. Because there's zero reason for Trumansburg ambulance to go to the city of Ithaca for a stub tow. Just as an example, it makes no sense, hold the call. That's how the system's designed, that's why the county pays pretty good price tag to using it, the EMD program, but we're not utilizing it, so there's been quite a few conversations about trying to get banks to actually get on board with that.
Thank you for your advocacy and what you're doing. That seems like a no-brainer, quite honestly.
Yes.
Yeah, and to be fair to our friends at the city of Ithaca, they don't have a contract with banks either. So they don't have any control over how those codes are managed.
Blew my mind when I first learned that.
Yeah.
They didn't have their own contract with Ford ambulance service.
Well, I've probably worked well for that for a long time.
Yes, continuing to apparently.
The last page is the budget breakdown. Unlike fire, we are still using a straight call volume based structure. I will say that we are, just like fire, we are, and I've said this for a couple of years and haven't found the magic formula. But we are looking at ways to potentially change the structure of this away from a simple call volume average. Just like fire, where you have fixed costs and variable costs, so too does EMS. The fixed costs are borne regardless of call volume, which we know is increasing, but it doesn't change how those two fixed versus variable kind of interplay. And although assessment is not, so assessment to me conceptually makes sense in fire because you're protecting property. It doesn't make sense to me conceptually with EMS because EMS is medical response. However, because the contracts are split and the municipalities apply them to a property tax base, assessment still plays a role in how costs are or how revenue is generated from our residents. I'm not quite sure. I'm not suggesting that I have anything even remotely approaching a formula to suggest, but there are other factors in splitting up an EMS department's costs than just call volume. And I continue to wrestle with that and hope to be able to come up with something that makes conceptual sense sometime. I don't have a timeline for it. I thought it was going to be a couple of years ago, but didn't work out that way. If anyone has any suggestions, if anyone has any, I've thought about models that use like insurance. Health insurance uses a covered life concept. So you have, the employee has the health insurance, they're the contract, but they have, a spouse and 5 kids. So there's 7 covered lives. And so your insurance costs are spread out over a pool of people. I've thought about trying to work something like that into an EMS model because it is medicine, it is healthcare. But I haven't come up with an elegant formula that withstands any type of testing. So if anyone has any recommendations, if you wake up in the middle of the night and think, this is how we split up an EMS budget more efficiently, then let me be your first email in the morning.
So I'm gonna jump in and put a little bit more of a fine point on that. So during our budget season, we had a constituent point out that taxpayers in the village are assessed roughly 3 times the amount per thousand in terms of their tax assessments as town of Ulysses taxpayers are. So your tax assessment in your EMS district is like 79 cents or something per thousand. Ours is about $2. So just for EMS. So our costs, even though you look at this and on as a per dollar figure, right? You can sort of trace the trends. If we were to all be one taxing district, our rate would drop immensely. So this is, as Roden says, I don't think we have a solution, but I just want to put a little bit of a finer point on the problem. This is something that I think I think because the towns have taxing districts where EMS costs are sort of separated, it's very easy for all of your constituents to sort of point out, like, why is this a thing? Why don't we get to do it? And I think you all get a lot of political pressure, and there's a lot of attention paid to this cost is a lot, right? We don't receive the same level of pressure, I think, generally in the village, because our EMS costs are mixed in and they're diffuse within our budget. But I think the reality is that if you pull out those numbers, again, on an assessed value, so per thousand or per thousand of assessed value, our village taxpayers are paying. Again, I only looked at the town of Ulysses. We haven't dug deep into this. So it's possible that the other towns are different. I don't know. But it is substantially, I mean, it's close to 3 times that rate. So as Roden points out, we don't have a solution. Several years ago, we went pretty deep down this rabbit hole, so I'm not confident that there is a solution. But that is the problem statement, I think. So something worth thinking about. This may be something that sort of billing group can tackle or at least talk about moving forward. But something just to sort of put in your thinking caps and give that some thought.
So if you look at call volume, the village call volume is very close, not far off the town of Ulysses call volume, and
Yeah.
yet the population is 40% less.
Right.
So there's something,
And our assessed value is also less.
rather the smaller village is getting a lot more calls per capita. Yeah. I wonder why that is. Has anyone ever looked at that? Is there?
So Roden and I did go down this rabbit hole, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago, to try and parse that out and to figure out what demographic information or what assessment data is relevant for calls, like what determines those things, and can we assess it in some more accurate way? And we didn't find any determining factor or anything that we could say was really causal in terms of.
Intuitively, we're thinking a more aging population, you have more call volume.
So if you look at
Well,
that,
roughly the same.
if you look at national averages, population centers always have more calls. So even though we're on a small scale, you have, 1/3 of the town of Ulysses population is in 1 square mile. And 2/3 is in the rest is 60 square miles, right? So a diffuse population geographically. And I don't know why. This is an interesting, maybe there's been some research done on it. But if you look at, let's just look at New York State. There are roughly 2 million EMS calls a year in New York State. 1 million of those occur in the 5 boroughs. The rest of the giant state has 1 million. So those population centers are always going to have an outsized number of calls.
That probably has to do with crime rates. Well,
It could be crime rates, it could be
school.
aging population. We do have a school
We have a
district.
school.
We have Juniper Manor, we have Compass, so it's the population centers that generate calls.
I mean, there's also psychology, right? Proximity to the station. There's a lot of factors
The
there.
one piece that's known to it, it's largely tied to incomes of households. They find the highest users of EMS are people less fortunate, and they often find themselves in an area such as Ithaca, Trumansburg, a centralized area because they don't have motor vehicles, where they can afford them, so they need to be close to grocery stores. So they're also some of the higher users. And I think just from my experience, I think that that's also a pretty big part in it as well. An additional piece is Juniper and Compass absolutely bring a large part of that too.
It's also fascinating if you ever want to really get out into the weeds on it. It's fascinating on the insurance side. So you look at town of Hector, we don't have billing on these sheets, but if you look at what town of Hector recoups from their fewer calls, it's very, very high. Because most of the EMS calls that result in a bill in the town of Hector have commercial insurance. Versus population centers where you have a lot more Medicare and a lot more Medicaid. So the reimbursement rates are much lower. So it's just a function of of how civilization spreads and or clusters. That medical emergencies tend to follow certain trends in those areas.
But I mean, I'm not disputing the medical emergencies, but you're not describing medical emergencies. You're describing a need for service that an ambulance is providing at an incredibly high cost point. So my question would be, and it might be worth talking about in this group, is there another way to provide what is clearly a needed service that's not being provided by somebody who's in an ambulance at a very high price point? So for instance, and this is a Ulysses resident, I know somebody who fell or whose partner fell. And the partner did not need to go to the hospital, but they did need somebody to come help them. Now, if I fell, my partner, if he couldn't do it, one of our friends would do it. But when you're elderly, that is not necessarily a safe option, right? And again, I know an ambulance came and this individual is, very pleased with the service. But that is one of the calls, I mean, it's on one of these years, is one of the calls that came and that the taxpayers paid for. Again, I don't want a taxpayer languishing on the floor. I don't necessarily think it necessarily needs to be our EMS.
It would be interesting to see that change, because if it became, let's say, the fire department, that's gonna significantly increase the use of the fire department, it's gonna increase burnout. I think.
I actually wasn't thinking fire.
It was just an example, so I think that there's implications to some options. And ultimately, it has to fall somewhere, and I'll be honest with you, a lot of those calls that are just, I need help up, turn into transports. And so that is probably one of the biggest reasons why it continues to fall on EMS, is just because of the unknown factor of them. There was, all kidding aside, we got a call a couple days ago for a fall, just fall down, hurt his nose, and 2 minutes later is a cardiac arrest.
I think it's also worth pointing out that's a lot of the goal of the county program, right? Is to take some of those less emergent calls, and that's also what Joel was talking about earlier, is trying to, focus our resources where they need to be. Some of those calls that can wait should. But it's a process.
More broadly, the broader part of your question, Caitlin, is one we've asked before. If they dial 911, there's only 3 things the county can do by law. It's fire, police, or EMS. So are there services that can assist? I think there are. People aren't necessarily aware of them, and it depends on the time of day. Should there be other services that the county is, we're back to the county, that the county helps fund, an arm of the Office for the Aging that can respond to non-emergency requests for help? That would be an interesting conversation. However, you would then need to amend state law so that when they call 911, there's a 4th option. So the sticking point is always going to be emergency response. If the dispatcher that answers the phone has only 3 options, then they're going to pick one.
Well, it sounds like the community education component is necessary.
It'd be interesting to see the effects of that, but I truly feel like the problem is systemic in the healthcare system. Because a large amount of our calls, our residents actually know that they don't want to go to the hospital. But they've had this severe abdominal pain for 3 days and they can't get into their primary for 3 months. So they're kind of left with no other options. That occurs in many different ways in the healthcare system. So I think it's much greater than just EMS. I think it's nationwide. Tough spot. That's some things have to change.
So to sort of go back a few steps, that's an example of something that we don't bill for, but we could.
Which?
Any kind of treatment where we don't transport.
Right?
We only bill for transports.
Right, but can they bill the insurance company for non-transport?
Yes.
Yes.
We absolutely can. It's fully our discretion. And I mean, separately, each municipality sets their own billing standard.
And I think, if we go back far enough, the evolution of all of this, Rich, of course, was, and Deb was involved.
And it was Deb's fault.
It was entirely Deb's fault. The evolution of this was when the village of Trumansburg first went to billing in 2011. There was a highly vocal outcry from a minority of our residents who felt that this was going to be detrimental to the provision of service to our residents, because in one person's words, I'll never forget, no one will call 911 for an emergency anymore because they'll be afraid of getting a bill. Well, call volumes clearly disprove that, but we went into that process saying, okay, yes, we want to be as gentle and as magnanimous as possible. We're really only looking to recoup costs from these transports that are happening anyway. Let's at least bill for those. And so that has carried on now for 13 years. And we have never really revisited that conversation of saying, you know, the individual who is treated at a scene or treated in their home, but now refuses the transport, but they've received some level of medical care. Should they not also be billed for that? We haven't revisited that conversation, and I think we probably should.
Well, when I came on the Ulysses board in 2013, we weren't doing it at all.
Yeah, right.
It took a couple of
So
years.
that came out of those initial conversations where it really was, and I wasn't there, so correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure your PTSD will kick in and there will be some jarring reactions here. But there was, as Rory said, a really vocal, I think, subset of the population that really wanted it to be an example of healthcare for all, free healthcare, sort of at the local level, and this being an expression of that sort of global national priority. And it, you know, whether or not that's appropriate or not, I think that really drove the Ulysses stance that there would be no bill for a long time. And
We left on the table insurance companies, we just keeping the money.
yes,
It was ridiculous.
Right.
that's
It's still raising rates, so.
I think that would be a good exercise for the meeting. We should do that.
Mhm.
well, like I said, well, like Joel said, my hope is that if we can switch our billing paradigm, we'll see those impacts. I think very quickly. And we'll have a sense of where that goes and we'll be able to mark it out year over year, what the trend is. And then from there, once we have that information, evaluating billing rates for different services is the next logical step.
So my understanding was some of the rates that we use are limits that Medicare would reimburse for or something.
So in some cases, there's a set rate. In some cases, there's a percentage. It depends. So like MVA, motor vehicle accidents are paid by motor vehicle insurance. So they recoup a much larger percent, but it really depends on the specific service has different rates depending on, you know, whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, private insurance, and all of those things.
Other questions, comments, contributions? Donations?
Yeah, fun rate,
No.
badly.
All right, so we will take a look at the equalization rates on the fire piece, send that back around.
I did.
Good with that. On that, and certainly we won't surprise anyone if we do wake up with inspiration on an EMS formula. And if anyone else has any suggestions, please pass them along. Anything else? Fire or EMS related?
Just to say that Joel and I will also reach out in the next couple of weeks as part about the billing and how to proceed there with the follow-up to the last couple questions we had.
Does the village board have any items of old or new business? Does anyone from the public have any comments or questions? All right, then I would entertain a motion to adjourn. So moved. Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor? Thank